everyone, welcome back. We'll continue with the presentation on the next metabolic pathway, the Hexose monophosphate pathway. The Hexose monophosphate pathway or the Pentose phosphate pathway, it occurs in two phases. The first is oxidative phase and the second is non-oxidative phase. In the oxidative phase, the glucose 6-phosphate, it gets converted into the ribose 5-phosphate and xylulose 5-phosphate. Here, actually, what is happening? Hexose, phosphorylated hexose, it is getting converted to phosphorylated pentoses. Okay, and during this reaction, carbon dioxide molecule is released as well as two molecules of NADPH are produced, and that is why it is known as the oxidative phase. Okay, in the second phase, that is non-oxidative phase, which we are going to explain in this particular slide, here NADPH are not getting produced, but instead we have intermediary products of glycolytic pathway being produced. Okay. The first reaction over here, it is transketolase reaction. Before we go into the first reaction, we can see that in the in the oxidative phase of the pentose phosphate pathway, it resulted in the production of ribose 5-phosphate and xylulose 5-phosphate through isomerization and epimerization from the Ribose 5-phosphate respectively. And during this process, actually one molecule of ribose and 5-phosphate and one molecule of xylulose 5-phosphate are produced, right? But for the non-oxidative phase of the HMP to continue, one molecule of ribose 5-phosphate and two molecules of xylulose 5-phosphate are to be required. I hope it is clear. For the HMP pathway to be continued, then especially the non-oxidative pathway to be non-oxidative phase of the HMP pathway to continue, one molecule of ribose 5-phosphate and two molecules of xylulose 5-phosphate has to be present. Are required. Okay, now what happens? That is the first step here is the transketolase reaction, during which the pentose phosphates are converted into a heptose and a triose. Okay, now what happens here? There is a 2-carbon glycol aldehyde is getting transferred from xylulose 5-phosphate to ribose 5-phosphate. When a 2-carbon is taken out from the xylulose 5-phosphate is a 5-carbon sugar, right? So when 2-carbon is compound is taken, it becomes 3-carbon compound, isn't it? So xylulose 5-phosphate on removal of glycol aldehyde, a 2-carbon compound, it becomes 3-carbon sugar. Okay. On the other hand, when glycol aldehyde is received by the ribose 5-phosphate, which is again a 5-carbon sugar, it becomes a 7-carbon sugar. Okay, so this is what happens. So here it results in the formation of, that is a transfer of 2-carbon glycol aldehyde from xylulose 5-phosphate onto ribose 5-phosphate will result in the formation of 7-carbon sugar, that is pseudoheptulose 7-phosphate, and a 3-carbon sugar, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Pseudoheptulose 7-phosphate, it is a phosphorylated ketoheptose. Okay, it is a ketosis and containing a 7-carbon. Okay, and this is a aldotriose, that is a triose with aldehyde. Okay, now the whole reaction is catalyzed by transketolase. This transketolase enzyme, it requires the presence of thiamine pyrophosphate, that TPP, and also magnesium ion for its activity. Okay, now the next one is transaldolase reaction. Okay, so during here what happens is a 3-carbon dihydroxyacetone phosphate. Okay, not phosphate, I'm sorry, dihydroxyacetone. 3-carbon dihydroxyacetone is removed from pseudoheptulose 7-phosphate and is transferred onto glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Okay, so when a 3-carbon compound is taken from a 7-carbon, it becomes 4-carbon compound. While glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, which is already a triose, when it receives a 3-carbon dihydroxyacetone, it becomes a 6-carbon sugar. Okay, so what happens is 3-carbon dihydroxy compound is transferred from pseudoheptulose 7-phosphate onto glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and results in the formation of erythrose 4-phosphate and fructose 6-phosphate. Okay, it is pseudoheptulose 7-phosphate which becomes erythrose 4-phosphate, and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, it becomes fructose 6-phosphate. The whole reaction is catalyzed by the enzyme transaldolase. Okay, so the fructose 6-phosphate, it can either enter glycolytic pathway or it can isomerize to produce glucose 6-phosphate, and this glucose 6-phosphate can re-enter the pentose phosphate pathway to the oxidative phase. Okay, glucose 6-phosphate, it can be the substrate for the pentose oxidative phase of the pentose phosphate pathway. Okay, now what happens to erythrose 4-phosphate? The erythrose 4-phosphate, it can continue with the reaction. You remember two molecules of cellulose 5-phosphate and one molecule of ribophosphate were required for the non-oxidative phase. One molecule of ribose 5-phosphate is already used up over here, and one molecule of cellulose 5-phosphate is also used. One more molecule is pending, and that is being used over here. Okay, so here that is the next or the second transketolase reaction, where you can see these two are the molecules which come into play. That is erythrose 4-phosphates which are produced through transaldolase reaction, and the second cellulose 5-phosphate molecule. Okay, here 2-carbon glycol aldehyde, it gets transferred from cellulose 5-phosphate on to erythrose 4-phosphate. Okay, so 2-carbon aldol molecule glycol aldehyde, when it is removed, 2-carbon is removed from the 5-carbon cellulose. It becomes glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, right? And when the 2-carbon glycol aldehyde is received by the erythrose 4-phosphate, it will become 4 plus 2, 6-carbon sugar, fructose 6-phosphate. Okay, so a 2-carbon glycol aldehyde group is transferred from cellulose 5-phosphate on to erythrose 4-phosphate, which results in the formation of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and fructose 6-phosphate. And the whole reaction is catalyzed by transketolase enzyme. Okay, now this is a hexose and this is one is a triose. Both these are intermediary substrates in the case of glycolysis. I hope you remember. These two may enter the glycolytic pathway. Or what happens is the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, it can produce fructose 6-phosphate, and this fructose 6-phosphate on the other hand, it can get isomerized to glucose 6-phosphate and then enter the oxidative phase of the pentose phosphate pathway. Okay, so here usually the glucose 6-phosphate molecule, 6 glucose 6-phosphate molecules are required for one complete pentose phosphate pathway. And out of these 6 glucose 6-phosphate molecules, 5 are regenerated in this way, in the non-oxidative phase. Okay, while one glucose 6-phosphate, it gets oxidized to carbon dioxide and water. So the complete oxidation of one molecule of glucose 6-phosphate in a pentose phosphate pathway will result in the formation of 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 12 molecules of NADPH and H+, okay, and 1 molecule of Pi. So this is how the whole reaction is completed. I hope this part is clear. So here you can see a summary of the whole thing. Oxidative phase, glucose 6-phosphate to 6-phosphogluconate to ribulose 5-phosphate. Ribulose 5-phosphate will give rise to ribose 5-phosphate and cellulose 5-phosphate. Okay, this will enter the non-oxidative phase. Okay, through transketolase and transaldolase, it may give back the glucose 6-phosphate and re-entering the oxidative phase once again. Okay, and the ribose 5-phosphate, it can also become the substrate for the synthesis of nucleotide, nucleic acid, coenzymes, etc. During this particular, so what are the byproducts? That is, the byproducts are ribose 5-phosphate, Na2, NADPH molecules. These NADPH molecules, it can be used for the enzyme synthesis, right, which involves glutathione reductase enzyme. It can also take part in reductive biosynthesis of fatty acids, glycerols, etc. from their precursor molecules. So this is all about the hexose monophosphate pathway. Okay, fine, thank you.